Welcome and thank you for finding your way to Columbus KTC today. My name is Marcus Casey. I'm a volunteer meditation instructor here at KTC, and we are very fortunate to have not just one, but three lamas who teach with us, but we do try to share the load a bit with some of the mentors, meditation instructors. So I try to teach here a bit as well. I haven't been available as much this year, so bear with me. This is my first Zoom teaching. I haven't taught, I think, since January, so I'm happy to be back teaching this morning. And thank you for joining. Be sure to mute your microphones so that we aren't hearing sounds from your house. And I apologize for sounds from my house. I have a very loud house with 3 children and 8 pets, so there will be likely sounds. All right, as usual, we often start our talks with the 4-line refuge prayer. And the prayer is in Tibetan. Some of you may know it and can do it at home. If you don't know it, feel free to just listen and make the aspiration that you will awaken and help others to awaken. When we are chanting this, we are repeating our commitment, taking refuge in the 3 jewels, the Buddha or the goal, what we aspire to, the Dharma or the path, and the Sangha, those who help us along the path. We will chant the refuge prayer just once this time. Om Sanje Chidang Soki Chognam La Jiangshu Bardu Dagi Gatsu Chi Dagi Jinso Gi Pe Sunangi Jola Pinshir Sanje Chu Parsho. And real quickly, take a moment to set your motivation for listening to this talk, that through this virtue, we may benefit all beings. Today, we're continuing our journey through the jewel ornament of liberation. This is the commentary version by Trungpa Rinpoche. And we are going to be talking about the first 3 of the 6 perfect virtues. Now, these 6 perfect virtues are known by several names: the 6 perfections, the 6 transcendent virtues, or the 6 paramitas, which is the Sanskrit word. The 6 are the perfection of generosity, the perfection of moral ethics, and the perfection of patience. Those are the 3 we're going to talk about today. And then next week will be the perfection of diligence, the perfection of meditative concentration, and the perfection of wisdom. So the 6 perfect virtues are the practices of the bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas are those who strive for Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. There are many in our community who have taken the bodhisattva vow. Lama Kathy likes to refer to those of us who are aspiring to this ideal as bodhisattvas in training. And so what we're talking about today are the actions of bodhisattvas in training as we seek to progress along the path toward Buddhahood. We can think of Buddhahood of bodhisattva actions as love in action, or compassion in action, or the living journey to enlightenment. The word paramita itself means other shore, or gone to the far shore. The idea is that samsara is a great ocean and nirvana is the far shore, and the paramitas move us to the far shore. They help us to transcend samsara. In fact, it can only be called a paramita if it helps you transcend. In order to be transcendent, these perfect virtues differ from common virtues. Common virtues are everyday goodness. They are important and good, but common virtues differ from transcendent virtues. A common virtue produces karma that has its result within samsara. A perfect virtue is part of a process that frees us from samsara. And the difference between common virtues and perfect virtues, as we will see, is not necessarily the action being performed, but the motivation behind that action. Hours, months, or years spent being kind, generous, studying and meditating will either bring good rebirth circumstances, and those alone, if they're done with a common motivation, or those same efforts can also contribute to the process of enlightenment. In other words, you are either still going round and round on the carousel of samsara, or else you are getting off of it. So what's the difference? What transforms an ordinary virtue into a perfect virtue? Two things. A perfect virtue has vast motivation. It is performed for the benefit of all beings. And second, a perfect virtue has pure motivation. It is selfless and without any hope for reward. So you can see that the difference between an ordinary virtue and a perfect virtue is in the mind of the person performing the action. It's the motivation that is present. And I apologize that we're going fast. We are covering 3 of these perfect virtues today, which means we have to move at a pretty fast clip. And the 3 we're covering today, again, are the perfection of generosity, the perfection of moral ethics, and the perfection of patience. And together, these 3 can be grouped together as the right conduct perfect virtues. So the first of the perfect virtues is generosity. Generosity, Trungpa Rinpoche defines it as the pure wish to give somebody something in order to help him or her. This wish is not tainted by any attachment to what you are giving. Now, it doesn't depend on the size or the quality of the gift, but on the pure intention with which it is given. And again, I keep coming back to that over and over, but that really is the key here. That really is what we're practicing here. Now, Trungpa Rinpoche talks a bit about why generosity is the first of the paramitas. Why do we practice it first? Because these can be thought of as a progression. And it's first for a couple reasons. First is that in order to practice the Dharma effectively, we must be willing to let go of our attachments. And generosity helps to loosen those attachments. Generosity is essentially a quality of not clinging. It's the ability to give those things away. And this shows that we're not very involved with things. We aren't very attached to worldly things. This means that since we don't have a great attachment to things, we can actually practice the Dharma with great strength. Our practice will be powerful because we won't be attached to worldly things. And if our practice is powerful and strong, then through full dedication, we will constantly be able to help others tremendously. And the second reason that generosity is taught first is because bodhisattvas need to benefit beings. And in order to benefit beings, they first must have a positive connection with those beings. And a positive connection can be established through the 3 main types of generosity. Giving the people things that they need, protecting them from fear or giving fearlessness, such as support and protection to those in distress, and through giving them the teachings. And all 3 of these, when done with the motivation of a bodhisattva, then create a strong connection with people so that we can be of greater benefit. I think, and I'll just throw this out there. This isn't necessarily in this particular text, but I like to think of our connections as a web, and this is often taught. So we are interconnected with all other beings through this vast web. And with some of those beings, we have a really close connection. And with other beings, it's further away in the interconnectedness. So then as we develop our practice, as we become more compassionate and more loving, it will affect others through that web. And it will affect those that we have a close connection with more strongly. And this is why it is important to develop close connections to others through generosity as we learn to live our motivation and our intention to benefit all beings. Now, as I keep reiterating, generosity is much more a matter of mentality than objects. It doesn't matter how much or how little you are able to give if you do it with the right motivation. Maybe you don't have a lot of material things to give, or the opportunity never arises to provide protection and fearlessness. Maybe giving the Dharma is out of reach for you right now. Maybe you're new to it yourself. But if your motivation is pure and you have a state of mind of generosity, that's what matters most. And with that pure state of mind, when opportunities do arise, you will act out of that generosity and be of great benefit. Khenpo Karcha Rinpoche says that even if we know just one line of Dharma, if we know it clearly and correctly, we can share it with others and benefit them. So the gauge of our generosity is not the quantity of the gift or the effect on the receiver. Those are important, but they're transient, whereas the liberation of the mind is the ongoing work that we are all about. So part of the definition of generosity is that it is the pure wish to help others. When we are practicing generosity, we do not do so in order to benefit ourselves, but instead with the thought to benefit all other beings. This will increase our generosity tremendously. Through the power of spiritual understanding, as we start to see results in our Dharma practice, we learn to expand generosity by having the right motivation, which is to bring all beings to Buddhahood, to not be attached to the object of the gift. I think this is a real key when we think about giving to others, that we are not being attached to what's being given, and we're not being attached to those to whom we're giving it to. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have love and compassion and concern for those that we're giving it to. But it's a different thing when you have attachment, because attachment is always asking, how does that person make me feel? And we can see the difference then between love and attachment in relationships, which is, the difference is the motivation to benefit the other person comes from a place of love, and the motivation to be benefited by that other person and the attachment to how that other person makes you feel, it comes from a place of attachment. So in the end, when we give, we need to learn to give without any hope or expectation as a result of our generous action. And this, of course, is tougher than it seems. Our egos are accustomed to constantly, calculating the angles, looking for whatever brings us an advantage. That's kind of the habit we have formed throughout our lives of making our way through this life is to take care of ourselves and look out for what benefits us. But that's not pure generosity. So it seems to me that when we perform any virtuous act and dedicate the merit to all beings, we are practicing generosity because we are not keeping the positive results of virtuous acts to ourselves, but mentally sharing them with all others. So at the end of this talk, we will dedicate the virtue to all beings. And we'll talk about that a little more too. And we encourage you always to set your motivation at the beginning of an activity, and then to dedicate the virtue of that activity to all beings. And that dedication itself is an act of generosity, because we're not trying to keep the positive karma or the merit gained by that virtue for ourselves, but we're willing to share that widely with all beings. Generosity is also made pure by practicing generosity while having an understanding of emptiness and having compassion. Now, that's a much bigger topic than I have time to get into, but the Dharma is often said to have two wings. On the one hand, there's the wing of compassion, and on the other hand, there is the wing of wisdom, or the understanding and eventual realization of the emptiness and limitlessness of all phenomena. And the more we learn to practice generosity out of a place of wisdom and understanding, and out of a place of compassion, then the more pure our generosity can be. When we practice generosity with the absence of three thoughts, then we don't introduce the idea of, and here are the three thoughts: someone giving something, someone receiving the gift, and the action of giving. And what I mean here is, and again, we can't go too in depth on this right now, but all three of those, the person, the doer, the receiver, and the action, all three of those are conceptual thoughts. And as we learn to move beyond conceptual thoughts and learn that none of those three thoughts exist in a reality that is fixed and permanent and real, then we can bring purity to our generosity. All right, and then Trungpa Rinpoche goes through the benefits of generosity. And again, when I say Trungpa Rinpoche, that's because that's the text we're using, but this all comes from Gampopa's text, The Jewel Ornament of Liberation. So generosity makes our feelings of wanting to benefit others concrete, not just theoretical. So we practice building this up in a lot of our meditation practices and in our dedications. We work on building that motivation of benefiting others, and then when we actually act on that, we bring a concreteness to it. With generosity, we are gathering a lot of virtue which will speed our journey to Buddhahood. The Buddha said, "What you give away is really yours, and what you keep is not yours." Being generous makes it easier to achieve enlightenment. Enlightenment is not hard to encounter for those who have been generous. And here's a quote I found interesting from the sutras, which says, "What I have given is mine. What I have hoarded is not mine. What has been given has purpose. What is hoarded is pointless. That which has been given does not require protection. What is hoarded does. That which has been given brings no anxiety. Whatever is hoarded is accompanied by worry. What has been given shows the way to Buddhahood. What is hoarded shows the quick way to evil. Giving will bring great wealth and hoarding will not. Giving will never know the end of wealth. Hoarding will exhaust it. And then a quick little story here. So a Buddhist monk was walking barefoot down a dusty road when he stepped on something sharp. It stuck in his heel, so after a few steps he stopped and he pulled it out of his foot, and it was a beautifully cut and very valuable gemstone. He rinsed it off at a well and tossed it in his bag, along with the piece of bread that would be his one meal of the day. A little further down the road, the monk happened on a beggar. The beggar spied the bread, leapt in front of the monk, bowed 3 times, and said, "O venerable monk, I am but a poor starving beggar. Might I have a taste of your bread?" The monk took the loaf from his satchel, and before giving it to the beggar, pulled the gem out from the crust where it had become embedded. He then handed the entire loaf to the beggar. The beggar saw the gemstone and pleaded, "O most worthy one, I have taken your only meal of the day, and this is not right. I see you have a gemstone which would relieve me of my situation. May I give you back your bread in exchange for the gem?" At this, the monk promptly gave the gemstone to the beggar, telling him also to keep the bread. The beggar was ecstatic and ran off down the road. The monk, noticing it was time for meditation, sat down under a nearby tree, and a few minutes later, he became aware of the presence of the beggar again, who had come back, and who thrust his hand out with the gem, saying, "O venerable one, may I please return the gem to you? I don't want it." The monk smiled and asked, "What then, sir, can you want now?" The beggar replied, "I want whatever it is that you have that allowed you to give away everything." I like that story. All right, moving on, because we do have to move quickly. The perfection of moral ethics. The second perfect virtue is the perfection of moral ethics. We have a tendency, if we've been raised in a very legalistic kind of upbringing, maybe a legalistic religious upbringing, or something like that, to kind of recoil when we think about moral ethics. But that's because what we've been handed a lot of times is a list of do's and don'ts, rather than what's really at the heart of moral ethics, which is not something hard and harsh, like a child who sees candy and the parent says, "No, you can't have it." It's not an order that forbids things or prevents us from having something nice or having any pleasures in life. What it is all about is addressing the fact that our minds are always full of desire, of wanting things. And this is the discipline to pull back from that desire. And as the Four Noble Truths teach us, that desire is never ending and will always lead to suffering. It will always leave us unsatisfied. It is the nature of desire that it is unquenchable. No matter how much we are involved with pleasing our desires, we will never actually find satisfaction, and desire never stops. The common metaphor is that of drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you get, and your thirst will never be quenched. The word for moral ethics or discipline in Sanskrit is shila, which means coolness. Coolness. So you can think of moral ethics as being a cool breeze on a blisteringly hot day. And in India, where these teachings were given, blisteringly hot days were very much a reality. This is the coolness that counteracts the heat of desire. So when your mind gets caught up in the heat of desire, we become confused, thinking that attaining the object of our desire will make us happy. And the coolness of moral ethics allows us to act out of a place of wisdom, recognizing the confusion that leads to suffering. Right conduct is about the conduct of our body, speech, and mind. And the Buddhist point of view is that right conduct is not achieved through a mindless or pious compliance with an external set of rules, but rather through the vows and commitments we make along the path. And the purpose of these vows are to perfect a pure state of mind. There are many vows that we can take. The entry into being a Buddhist is the refuge vow, in which we vow to take refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. There are also the 5 lay precepts. You can choose to take as many or as few of these as you wish. The 5 precepts are not to kill, not to steal, not to engage in sexual misconduct, not to lie, and then the 5th one, not to take intoxicants, which taking that vow protects the other 4, because you are more likely to engage in the other 4 if your mind is in a state of intoxication. So taking a vow is setting a firm intention. It is much stronger than just avoiding these actions. You know, yesterday I didn't kill anybody. Is there good karma in not killing anybody yesterday on December 12th? Not really. I was just kind of going about my day and it didn't come up, right? But when you consciously take a vow not to kill every day for your whole life, then there is actually a very positive virtue that comes whenever you stay in line with that vow. Like generosity and all the paramitas, the key point is to have a pure motivation. So the first type of moral discipline is to eliminate faults that are sure to cause suffering to ourselves and others. It isn't that we're following a rule because the Buddha said so. It's that if the nature of the action is to cause suffering, it will cause suffering. The coolness of moral discipline allows us to avoid this suffering by avoiding harmful activities, whether the harm or the suffering would be towards someone else or to ourselves. It's that coolness, that vow, that moral discipline that allows us to step back and make a wise choice. So we avoid what causes suffering, and then the second type of moral discipline is to practice what is virtuous. Virtuous acts lead to happiness. And then the third type is to benefit others. The universal mistake people make is thinking that they will find happiness by seeking happiness for themselves. The truth is that there will always be people and circumstances that will stand in our way. But Shantideva, in the Guide of the Bodhisattva Way of Life, says, all the joy the world contains has come through wishing happiness for others. All the misery the world contains has come through wanting pleasure for oneself. So like generosity and all the 6 perfect virtues, the way to make moral ethics pure is to have both compassion and the wisdom of emptiness. These are the practices that make moral ethics pure. And this really does become a bulletproof framework for thinking when you are contemplating difficult moral issues in our day. And that is to run it through the matrix of, does this cause suffering? Or will this create virtue? And will this benefit others? That really is the framework for Buddhist ethics. So the third perfect virtue is the virtue practiced, is the practice of patience. And as I was talking, for those of you who are on a little early, some of these, and especially this one, is more a matter of do as I say, not as I do. These teachings come from our teachers who have perfected the practices that I'm talking about, and the practices of patience, not from me, myself. So before we get into talking about patience in depth, we first need to talk about anger. Anger is the source of many problems, and the book calls out 5 problems caused by anger, 4 that it calls temporal problems, and 1 that it calls an ultimate problem. So the first problem that anger causes is that it destroys virtue. The very point of Dharma, according to Trungpa Rinpoche, is to avoid harming others and to help them find the path to happiness, to benefit them and to make them happy. Anger stands in direct contrast to this. When we become angry, our motivation becomes the opposite. We want to harm and cause suffering. So moments of anger undo the goodness that we have already created. Again, turning to Shantideva, he says, all the good works gathered in 1,000 ages, such as deeds of generosity and offerings to the blissful ones, a single flash of anger shatters them. Now, don't be too discouraged by this. But the point is that, I mean, take a look at prisons. How many people in prison are there because of a single flash of anger and what they did as a result of that? And how much suffering then on the part of their victims and the families of their victims because of that single flash of anger. So don't, discount what they're saying as being hyperbolic. Anger is a serious problem. Not only does it cancel out our virtue, but it takes away our happiness. Anger is poisonous to the mind. In the same way that poison makes your body sick, anger makes your mind sick. It causes stress in your mind that can actually also have physical ramifications. Anger may keep you up at night. If you're angry at something, if you're angry at someone, you may wish unhappiness for them. And that anger actually keeps you from being happy. So that poison that you wish for them is actually poison in your own mind. The third problem of anger is that it will eventually separate us from our friends and loved ones. Harboring anger in our minds can make us very unpleasant to be around. At first, someone may commiserate with our anger, but the more and more anger consumes us, the more toxic we become to others, even if we are nice to them. As a little aside, I've seen this happen on social media, especially here in 2020, in which it's been quite difficult not to allow things to create anger in us that eventually consume us. We've spent a while now talking about anger, and I won't belabor that point any longer. Because the perfect virtue we're supposed to be talking about here is patience, but that's because patience is the remedy for anger. There is a remedy for anger. Shantideva says, "No evil is there similar to anger, no austerity to be compared with patience. Steep yourself, therefore, in patience in various ways, insistently." I love that word, insistently. The Bodhisattva path is not a path for weakness. The Bodhisattva path requires great strength. Insistently, we must continuously practice patience. Trungpa Rinpoche says that patience is one of the most important qualities we need to have in order to accomplish Buddhahood. In fact, he says that without it, it's impossible to become a Buddha. Without patience, we cannot hold in our minds the positive motivation to benefit others. So the fifth problem of anger is that it keeps us from Buddhahood and therefore from being as much benefit to others as possible. So what is patience? How do we define patience? We define it as an undisturbed mind and an absence of retaliating reactions. This is possible with a compassionate attitude toward others, even toward someone who is harming us. And this is why we practice relaxing our minds. By practicing meditation, we create a space between our thoughts and our awareness, between our reactions and our awareness. This space, the more we practice and the more resilient it becomes the way we are able to resist being controlled by thoughts and emotions, even such strong, disturbing emotions as anger. The jewel ornament of liberation tells us there are three kinds of patience. The patience of not being disturbed by the harm done by others, the patience of accepting suffering, and the patience in understanding the Dharma. So the patience of not being disturbed by the harm done by others. This is all in the 6th chapter of the Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life by Shantideva, which I highly encourage you to check out on your own and really spend some time with it. I only have a little time to summarize some of the main points here, but it is worth listing the considerations Shantideva lists when faced with a difficult person or someone who does you harm. Consider, and these are basically mental exercises you can go through when you have someone who is causing you harm and you feel anger rising up in your mind. These are some exercises you can go through to apply to this situation. First, consider that those who harm us have no freedom. They are out of control and driven by their disturbing emotions, such as anger. 2, consider the harm that they are doing us as the result of our own karma. Whatever harm we experience is the result of our own previous actions, ultimately. 3, consider that the harm is the fault of our own body. If we didn't have a body, that is, if we didn't continue to return to samsara, then the other person wouldn't be able to harm us. So we are also creating the conditions for that harm. Consider that the harm is the fault of our own mind. Our mind is mistakenly clinging to and identifying with an illusory self, and that is why we can be hurt. Now, it's at this point that I want to offer a little caveat. something that we know from Western psychology and from what we've learned. There are cases in which you are in an abusive relationship, in which some of these exercises could be counterproductive to your mental health and to doing what you need to do to escape from that abuse. So this should not ever be confused with blaming yourself for an abusive relationship that you are in. The next one, consider that both of you have equal fault. If someone is angry with us, we have likely done something that makes us angry. Conflict has two sides, and sometimes we fail to consider our part in. Again, with the caveat about an abusive relationship. 6, consider the benefit that is received in the situation. The other person is giving us an opportunity to practice patience and to transform the suffering. It is said that, I believe it was Atisha when he brought teachings to Tibet, he had heard this glowing reputation that the Tibetan people had for being just wonderful. And he was worried that he would not have any chance to practice patience if this were the case when he went to Tibet. So he brought along an attendant who was particularly annoying so that he could continue to practice patience. Now, he ultimately sent him home because he found out that the Tibetan people were just like anyone else and could definitely cause frustration and be the source of practicing patience. The 7th one is consider gratitude. Just like the last one, if the person who harms us is giving us an opportunity to practice patience. So be grateful to them. They are our teachers as well. Consider how all the Buddhas are pleased when we practice patience. Practicing patience is like an offering to the Buddha. And consider the great benefits. When we talked indirectly about this when we talked about the problems of anger, but having patience allows us to benefit beings, and that is necessary for moving toward Buddhahood. When someone does you harm and you practice patience and do not retaliate, then you are bringing benefit, which will move you toward Buddhahood. Now, there are 5 different techniques of meditation for patience. And the first is thinking of feeling close to the one who harms us. Consider that at one time or another, this person was our mother, father, or someone else very dear to us. Those who have learned the practice of Tonglen, this can I've heard Lama Kathy also teach that sometimes you're not ready to give your happiness to that person in meditation. And that Khenpo Garju Rinpoche said, just visualize yourself bringing them a gift. Every day, visualize the person in front of you and visualize yourself handing them a gift. Again, this is to break through that anger that comes up and create space for patience. 2, remember that everything depends on interdependent conditions. Enemy and friend are conceptual constructs that depend on our minds. Our self and the other person's self are similarly not permanent fixed reality. So who is harming whom? 3, think of impermanence. The person harming us is impermanent, as are we. This is not a permanent situation. Think of suffering. Be aware that the person harming us is also suffering. And think of fully embracing all beings. Remind ourselves that we are committed to cherishing all beings. So that's all the first type of suffering. The first type of patience, which is patience in the face of someone who is harming us. The second, also very, very timely in 2020, the patience of accepting suffering. We will experience pain in this life. We will experience loss, discomfort, pain, and death. We're in the middle of a pandemic right now. We've all recently lived through political upheaval, economic upheaval, and war. And yet when suffering comes, we have a tendency to take it personally. Why is this happening to me? Trungpa Rinpoche reminds us not to take suffering personally and remember that it happens to everyone, regardless of our specific circumstances. And we can avoid compounding it by adding to it our negativity. In actual fact, we can learn to use our suffering to wake up, to transform it. We learn to deal with the smaller sufferings of our lives to teach us to deal with the great problems of existence. We can allow our suffering to teach us compassion rather than bitterness. There is a wisdom in all suffering. The second of the Four Noble Truths tells us that suffering has a cause, and that cause is clinging to a self that we expect to be permanent, unchanging, and real. We torture ourselves with desire for that which is impermanent and will not bring us lasting happiness, and with aversion to that which we dislike. But if we learn to look for wisdom in our suffering, we will begin to understand how we create this suffering for ourselves. When we learn to accept our present suffering, we move toward overcoming all suffering. And the final patience is that of understanding the Dharma. The teachings of the Dharma are very deep and subtle, and that can be very discouraging to some people who feel like they will never be able to grasp them. Trungpa Rinpoche says there's no need to be discouraged. He says just as hard work pays off in other areas of our lives, just as we're used to going to work every day and working hard and we're working toward a goal, maybe with our teammates at work, maybe the goal of taking care of our families, all the education we achieved. He says Dharma practice pays off in the same way. If you have the patience to continually work, that will also pay off. So Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche says that practicing the 6 perfect virtues, the first 3 of which we talked about today and the next 3 which will be covered next week, those include everything necessary to follow the path of the Bodhisattvas. None can be omitted. They must all be practiced and ultimately perfected. So I would like to leave you with a 3-part practice to help you transform your ordinary generosity, your ordinary ethical conduct, and your ordinary patience into transcendent activities that lead to enlightenment and are great benefit for all beings. And we talked about this a little bit, and I won't, because we're running a little late, and I want to save some time for questions. I'll go through this very quickly, but these 3 practices are known as the 3 excellences. And that is excellent at the beginning, before we engage in any activity, no matter how small or large. whether it's cooking breakfast or starting a new job or a new relationship, whatever it is, we set our motivation to be the motivation of a bodhisattva, that the wish that all sentient beings be freed from all suffering and the cause of suffering, and attain the state of complete, perfect enlightenment. And we leave no beings out of this. We perfect any action by bringing to it that kind of purity and expansiveness of motivation. And then, while we're practicing the activity, we establish the second excellence, excellent in the middle, which is an excellent mindset during that activity. And that is, we practice seeing everything as illusory, dreamlike, and transient. We recognize that we ourselves, everyone around us, and everything around us are constantly undergoing change, moment by moment. It is impossible to identify any true, substantial, permanent nature. And then, at the end of an activity, we practice the third excellence, excellent at the end. And this final excellence is the dedication. We set our motivation before the activity. We created an aspiration which was expansive and included all beings. Now, at the end, we return to that aspiration and we dedicate the virtue gained in the activity to all beings. So practice this week, supercharging your practice by taking every activity, every mundane activity that you have the mindfulness to remember to do, and practice in this way. Bring that pure motivation of benefit, the wisdom of emptiness, the compassion of wanting to benefit all beings, to every activity, and remember then to dedicate that virtue to all beings at the end. We do have time for questions, and I saw one come up in the chat here. So, what would be the source of anger according to the author? So, I think the source of anger is the source of all of our disturbing emotions, which is, in short, that we don't get our way, right? The source of all of our suffering is attachment and aversion. Think of yourself as standing in a stream that is constantly going by. And rather than recognize that we are in a stream of constant motion and movement, that we are in the middle of impermanence, where everything flows by and nothing stays still, we forget that. And so we try to grasp onto something and say, I like this. I want it to stay just like it is. I want to be just as happy in this relationship as I am now. As that starts to change, we say, I was happier yesterday. That person's doing something to me that is making me not have that same happiness as yesterday. And so we cling and we blame, and we start to make up a story in our minds about something that is changing. And at the root of that story is the desire for it not to change. And on the flip side of that, we do exactly the opposite, with things we don't like. I don't like this, therefore I want it to go away. And so whatever story I tell myself about what is the source of putting that in front of me, of making me go through this, then I develop an aversion to that. And suddenly, again, I'm not accepting reality. I'm not accepting suffering. I'm not accepting what's there. I'm instead pushing against it. And I'm building anger toward whatever I've identified as the source. But through some of these practices that we talked about today, then instead of building that anger up, we create a place of patience. We create that space where we can recognize the reality that we live in, the reality of samsara, the causes and conditions that are at the root of everything that arises, and likewise the impermanence of everything that arises. All right, we have another question. Tom asks, when it comes to generosity, is there a difference between the types of generosity we develop in Tonglen, mandala practice, versus the person-to-person generosity, if, by example, we donate food or volunteer? So, the elsewhere, and it may have been in the talk last week, if I remember right. I'm not totally sure. But elsewhere, there was a talk about pure intentions and pure actions, and how pure motivations, and I mean, you know, the purity of motivation and the purity of actions. And I think Shantideva says something like preparing to go and setting out. Those are the two differences. So we need both. We need the preparation. We need the time on the cushion where we are developing a mind of generosity in Tonglen, and where we are creating the generosity of offering in mandala practice. We need that. And we also need the person-to-person real generosity, the setting out, in which we actually help other beings and create that connection, and which we actually offer and practice the offering practice. I will mention today that, and I can put the link here in the chat, we always like to mention that we are purely a volunteer organization, and we are happy to be the recipient of some of your generosity so that we can keep going, but not the only generosity that you practice. So I put that in there. But yes, there does need to be a practical part of it. And I think that practical part flows naturally from our practice on the cushion. The more we practice Tonglen, the more we practice mandala practice, the more we become generous people, the more generosity becomes our natural way of acting, and the more joy we will find in doing it as much as we can. All right, are there any other questions? I don't see any more coming in the chat. Give just a second if anyone has any more. And thank you. Yes, you do have homework this weekend, this week. Thank you, Sydney. I am giving everyone homework. Work hard on trying to practice all three of the three excellences with every activity. Set that motivation. Remember the emptiness in all activity, and then dedicate the merit. So let's do that right now. Let's dedicate the merit of the virtue that has been created in learning from Gampopa and Trungpa Rinpoche today about how to follow the Bodhisattva path in the first three of the perfect virtues. And let's not hold this virtue to ourselves, but give it expansively to all beings. May the virtue we have generated today enrich all beings, that they may come to happiness and freedom from suffering. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good week, and we'll look forward to seeing you back here next week.
Thank you for your teaching. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.